It snowed the night she begged for work, and by morning, nothing about her life would ever be the same. Not because she found a job, but because a hardened cowboy with a past as cold as the winter air looked her in the eyes and said something no desperate woman expects to hear. I need a lover more than a worker. And though it sounded like madness at first, that single sentence would pull two broken souls into a story neither of them saw coming. The wind howled like a living thing through the narrow streets of Dry Hollow, whipping snow into every corner and crevice, erasing footprints as fast as they were made. And in the middle of that merciless storm walked Eliza Carter, her coat too thin, her boots worn nearly through, her breath coming out in weak, uneven clouds as she knocked on yet another door that would not open. She had been walking since dawn, stopping at every shop, every stable, every home with a lantern lit in the window, offering to scrub floors, wash clothes, cook meals, anything for a few coins or even a warm meal. But the answer had been the same each time, either silence or a hard shake of the head, because people in Dry Hollow remembered things, and they remembered her, though not kindly. Some said she had run from trouble back east. Others whispered worse, and in a town like that, whispers were as good as truth, and truth was enough to leave a woman freezing in the snow. By the time she reached the last building at the edge of town, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely lift them to knock. But she did anyway. 3 weak taps against the wood before the door creaked open just a fraction and a man's shadow filled the gap. "We ain't hiring," he said before she could speak, and the door shut again, final as a gunshot, leaving her alone with the storm. For a moment, she stood there, staring at the grain of the wood as if it might change its mind. Then slowly, her shoulders sank, and something inside her, something stubborn and determined that had carried her this far, began to crack under the weight of cold and hunger and rejection, and she turned away from the town, not because she had somewhere else to go, but because there was nowhere left to try. The land beyond Dry Hollow stretched out wide and empty, rolling hills now buried under a thick blanket of white, fences half hidden, the sky low and gray as if pressing down on the earth, and out there, barely visible through the curtain of snow, stood a lone ranch house, its silhouette dark against the pale horizon, smoke curling faintly from its chimney like a promise of warmth. Eliza hesitated, knowing it was a long walk, knowing whoever lived out there might be worse than the folks in town. But the alternative was to stay where she was and let the cold decide her fate, and so she pulled her coat tighter around her and started walking. Each step was heavier than the last, the snow rising to her ankles, then her calves, her breath growing shallow as the wind pushed against her. But she kept going, driven by something deeper than hope, something closer to sheer refusal to lie down and disappear. By the time she reached the gate, her vision blurred at the edges, and she had to grip the wooden post to steady herself before forcing her legs to carry her the rest of the way to the house. She knocked once, then again, harder this time, and when the door finally opened, she found herself looking up at a man who seemed carved from the same harsh land around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined not by age but by years of silence, a dark coat thrown over work-worn clothes, and eyes that watched her with a steady, unreadable calm. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like it hadn't been used much. Eliza swallowed, her throat dry, her words catching for a moment before she forced them out. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice barely stronger than the wind. "I can cook, clean. I can help with the animals. I just need a chance." The man didn't answer right away, his gaze moving over her, not in the way she had come to expect from men, not with hunger or judgment, but with something more careful, more deliberate, as if he were trying to see past the surface to something deeper, and for a long, quiet moment, the only sound between them was the storm. Then he leaned slightly against the doorframe and said, almost casually, "I don't need a worker." The words hit her like all the others had that day, and she felt the last thread of her strength begin to snap. But before she could turn away, before she could gather what little dignity she had left and walk back into the cold, he spoke again, and this time, his voice carried something unexpected, something that made her pause. "I need a lover more than a worker." Eliza blinked, certain she had misheard him, her mind struggling to make sense of the words as they hum in the frozen air between them. For a second, anger flared, sharp and protective, because she had heard propositions before, had learned to recognize the tone of men who thought desperation made a woman easy to claim. But there was no smirk on his face, no trace of mockery or demand, just that same steady, searching look in his eyes, and it confused her more than anything else. "I didn't come for that," she said, her voice steadier now, though her hands still shook. "I came for honest work." The man nodded slowly, as if he respected the answer, but he didn't step aside, didn't offer the simple solution she had hoped for. Instead, he said, "Name's Cole Bennett. This place gets mighty quiet in the winter. Too quiet. I can handle the work just fine." He paused, glancing briefly out at the storm before looking back at her. "But I ain't built to sit through months of silence anymore." Eliza studied him then, really studied him, trying to find the trick in his words, the hidden intention. But all she saw was a man who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's labor. A man who had spent too long alone with his own thoughts. The wind picked up again, biting through her coat, reminding her of the choice she faced, and she felt it pressing in on her from all sides. Pride on one hand, survival on the other, and somewhere in between, a strange, uncertain possibility she didn't fully understand. "You offering me a place to stay?" she asked quietly. Cole's gaze didn't waver. "I'm offering you a chance to stay alive," he said. "Rest of it, we figure out as we go." The simplicity of it, the lack of pressure or expectation in his tone, unsettled her more than any demand could have, because it left the decision entirely in her hands. And for the first time that day, she wasn't being turned away, she was being asked to choose. Behind her, the world was nothing but snow and closed doors, and ahead of her stood a man she didn't know, offering something she hadn't come looking for, but might not survive without. And as Eliza Carter stood there on the threshold of that lonely ranch, with the storm raging and her future hanging by a thread, she realized that whatever she decided in that moment would not just determine where she slept that night. It would decide the course of everything that came after. The arrangement between them began in silence, the kind that pressed in from all sides and made every small sound feel louder than it should. And though Eliza had stepped into Cole Bennett's home to escape the cold, she quickly realized the real challenge wasn't the winter outside. It was learning how to exist beside a man who had forgotten what it meant to share space with another soul. The first few days passed with careful distance, unspoken boundaries drawn as clearly as the frost along the window panes. Cole rising before dawn to tend to the horses and cattle, while Eliza quietly made use of whatever she could find in the kitchen, stretching his limited supplies into warm meals that neither of them commented on, though he always finished every bite, and she always made just enough for two without asking if he'd sit down with her, because something about him suggested that asking too much, too soon, might send him retreating back into whatever loneliness had carved those deep lines into his face. Still, survival had a way of forcing cooperation, and by the end of the first week, their lives began to overlap whether they intended it or not. Eliza followed him out to the barn one morning, despite the bitter cold, offering to help with the animals, and though Cole hesitated, watching her struggle to lift a bucket half frozen at the handle, he didn't stop her, and when she slipped on the icy ground moments later, it was his hand that caught her before she hit the floor, firm and steady, pulling her back up with a quiet, careful, before stepping away again as if even that brief contact had crossed a line he wasn't sure how to handle. Days turned into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged but both relied on. She cooked, cleaned, mended what she could. He worked the land, fixed what was broken, kept the ranch running. And somewhere in between, small conversations began to form, hesitant at first, then a little easier, though never quite comfortable, like two strangers learning a language neither had spoken in years. But the world beyond the ranch had not forgotten Eliza Carter, and it wasn't long before the past she had tried to outrun came knocking, carried on the boots of men who rode out from Dry Hollow under the pretense of concern, but with judgment written plainly across their faces. They arrived one gray afternoon, their horses restless in the cold, their eyes scanning the property with thinly veiled suspicion, and when Cole stepped out to meet them, his presence alone seemed to slow whatever accusations they had come prepared to make, though not enough to silence them entirely. "Heard you took her in," one of them said, his tone edged with implication, his gaze flicking toward Eliza as she stood in the doorway behind Cole, her posture stiff but unyielding. "Folks are talking." Cole didn't respond right away, his stance relaxed but grounded, like a man who knew exactly where he stood and wasn't interested in being moved. "Folks always talk," he said finally, his voice even. "Ain't much I can do about that." The man smirked slightly, as if expecting more, as if waiting for Cole to defend himself or deny whatever rumors had already begun to spread. But when no explanation came, his attention shifted to Eliza, and that's when the tension sharpened, because the way he looked at her wasn't curiosity. It was judgment, the same kind she had faced in town, the same kind that had left her knocking on doors that would never open. "You planning to stay out here?" he asked her directly, and for a moment, the old instinct rose in her, the urge to shrink, to deflect, to say whatever would make the confrontation end. But something about the way Cole stood in front of her, not shielding her, but not abandoning her either, gave her just enough strength to answer differently. "I'm staying as long as I'm needed," she said, her voice steady despite the way her hands tightened at her sides. And though it wasn't a declaration, it was enough to shift something in the air, enough to make the men exchange glances before finally turning their horses back toward town, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. That evening, the tension lingered between Eliza and Cole, not because of what had been said, but because of what hadn't, and as they sat across from each other at the small wooden table, the flickering lantern casting soft shadows along the walls, Eliza found herself studying him again, searching for answers she hadn't asked for. "You didn't tell them anything," she said finally, breaking the quiet. Cole shrugged slightly, his focus on the cup in his hands. "Didn't see the need." "They think," she started, then stopped, unsure how to put it into words without giving those rumors more weight than they deserved. But Cole looked up then, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that cut through the uncertainty. "I don't much care what they think," he said, and there was no bravado in it, no defiance for the sake of pride, just a simple truth, spoken by a man who had already lost whatever connection he once had to other people's opinions. The honesty of it caught her off guard, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to ask the question that had been sitting quietly at the back of her mind. "Why did you say that?" she asked. "About needing a lover." The word felt strange on her tongue, heavier than it should have been, and for a moment, Cole didn't answer, his gaze drifting toward the window where the storm had long since passed, but the snow still lay thick across the land. "Had someone once," he said after a while, his voice quieter now, carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Long time ago. She didn't take well to this kind of life." He paused, as if deciding how much to say, then added, "Lost her to it. Or maybe to myself. Never quite figured which." Eliza didn't interrupt, sensing that whatever he was offering now was not something he gave freely, and when he finally looked back at her, there was something unguarded in his expression, something raw, though carefully contained. "Since then, it's just been work," he continued. "Work and quiet. Too much of both, if I'm being honest." The admission settled between them, not uncomfortable, but real, and it shifted something in the way Eliza saw him, not just as the man who had made an unusual offer in the middle of a storm, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry loneliness like a second skin. "And you think I can fix that?" she asked, not mocking, just curious. Cole shook his head slightly. "Ain't about fixing," he said. "Just not being alone in it." The simplicity of that answer lingered long after the conversation ended, and as the days continued, the space between them began to change in subtle ways. He started leaving an extra blanket near the fire without comment. She began setting his coffee beside him before he asked, and though neither spoke of the arrangement they had yet to define, it grew into something that felt less like an agreement and more like a shared understanding. But with that understanding came something neither of them had planned for, something far more complicated than survival: the slow, undeniable shift from strangers bound by circumstance to two people beginning to see each other clearly. And with that clarity came risk, because feelings, once they took root, were far harder to manage than the cold, and far more dangerous when left unspoken. The storm that came next did not arrive with warning. It rolled in like a wall of white, swallowing the horizon in a matter of hours, heavier and more violent than anything Eliza had seen since coming to the ranch, and by the time the wind began to scream against the walls, it was already too late to prepare for anything beyond survival. Cole had sensed it coming in the way the animals shifted restlessly and the sky dimmed too quickly, and without a word, He had begun securing what he could, his movements sharper, more urgent than she had ever seen, and Eliza, understanding enough now to read the weight in his silence, followed without hesitation, helping where she could, her hands moving faster despite the cold biting through her gloves, because whatever this storm was, it wasn't something either of them could face alone. The hours that followed blurred into a relentless battle against the elements, snow piling high against the barn doors, wind threatening to tear loose anything not nailed down, the horses panicking in their stalls until Cole forced his way through the drifts to calm them, with Eliza close behind, refusing to stay inside no matter how many times he told her it was safer, because safety had stopped being her priority the moment she realized what this place, and this man, had come to mean to her. At one point, a section of the fence gave way under the weight of ice and wind, sending a small group of cattle scattering into the storm, and without thinking, Cole went after them, disappearing into the white before she could stop him, leaving Eliza standing at the edge of the world, her heart pounding harder than the wind itself, because she knew what it meant to lose someone to circumstances like this, knew how quickly a person could vanish and never come back, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she was no longer the woman who had walked out of Dry Hollow, but the one who had lost everything before she ever got there. She didn't wait. Pulling her coat tighter, she stepped into the storm after him, the cold hitting her like a force meant to drive her back. But she kept going, calling his name though the wind stole the sound from her lips, her vision reduced to shifting shadows and endless white, until finally, through the blur, she saw him, half hidden behind a struggling animal, his movements slower now, the storm taking its toll even on him, and without thinking, she pushed forward, reaching him just as the animal broke free. Again, nearly knocking her off her feet before Cole caught her, his grip firm despite the exhaustion in his arms. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice strained but sharp with something that wasn't anger. It was fear, the kind he hadn't shown her before. "Neither should you," she shot back, breathless, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that cut through everything else. And in that moment, whatever distance had once existed between them disappeared entirely, replaced by something raw and undeniable. Together, they managed to turn the cattle back toward the ranch, each step a fight, each second stretched thin by the weight of the storm, but they didn't let go of each other, not once. And when they finally stumbled back into the barn, slamming the doors against the wind, the silence that followed felt almost unreal, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the low, restless shifting of the animals around them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the intensity of what had just happened settling in slowly. And then, without warning, Eliza let out a shaky laugh. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was to feel everything at once, and she wasn't sure she could hold it all together if she did. "Guess that answers your question," she said, her voice unsteady but warm. Cole frowned slightly, still catching his breath. "What question?" She met his gaze, her expression softer now, more open than it had ever been. "About not wanting to be alone in it." The words hung there between them, simple but heavy with meaning, and something shifted in Cole's expression, something that had been locked away for longer than either of them could measure, finally giving way under the weight of everything they had just faced together. "You could have stayed inside," he said quietly, though it wasn't a reprimand, just a statement of fact. Eliza shook her head. "Not anymore," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice now, no trace of the uncertainty that had followed her to his door that first night in the snow. "If this place goes down, I go with it. If you go out into that storm, I follow." The honesty of it hit harder than the wind ever could, and for the first time, Cole didn't look away, didn't retreat behind the walls he had built so carefully over the years. Instead, he stepped closer, the space between them closing not out of necessity, but choice, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "That ain't a small thing you're saying." "I know," she answered, her eyes holding his, unwavering. "I'm done running from things that matter." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full, charged with everything neither of them had been ready to admit until now. And slowly, almost cautiously, Cole reached out, his hand brushing against hers, giving her just enough time to pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers tightened around his, grounding them both in something real, something stronger than the storm still raging outside. By the time the blizzard finally passed, leaving the world buried under a thick, quiet blanket of snow, something fundamental had changed between them. Not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in the kind of steady, undeniable shift that comes from shared struggle and unspoken trust. And when the people from Dry Hollow eventually rode out again, expecting to find the same uncertainty they had left behind, they were met with something entirely different. Eliza standing beside Cole, not behind him, not uncertain or out of place, but rooted, as much a part of the ranch as the land itself. And Cole, for his part, no longer carried that same distant edge in his gaze, because whatever loneliness had once defined him had been replaced by something quieter, stronger, and far more enduring. He had said he needed a lover more than a worker, but what he had found, and what Eliza had chosen, was something neither of them had known how to ask for at the start. A partner, in every sense of the word. Someone who would stand in the storm instead of waiting it out. Someone who would choose to stay when leaving might have been easier. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting light across the endless stretch of white, it revealed not just a ranch that had survived the winter, but two lives that had found their way out of the cold, together.